say it twice. Bismillah, Bismillah, Ar-Rahman, Alhamdulillah, Salatu Wassalamu ala Rasulillah, wa ba'd. Inshallah, nice to be here and to be with you all. This is an important subject, but it's a little bit of a heavy subject. So one thing that we're talking today about mental health, and since it is a heavy subject, it doesn't need to be heavy. It doesn't need to be as heavy as it needs to be. The way we're going to lighten that load today is on the count of 3. And this is a cool room to do this in. We're going to laugh at the absolute loudest that you can laugh. I hope that's not it. It's not that loud. That was loud. All right, ready? 1, 2, 3. The second round that's louder than the first round. You hear each other's fake laughs that makes the real laugh. Alright, now be quiet. Or cool, like this, everybody's quiet. Alright. So today we're talking about mental health. And this is a reality in our lives today, but the reality is that it's always been a reality. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit as well, even in terms of our deen, our understanding. When you look in the Quran, when you look in the Sunnah of our Prophet ﷺ and his life and the life of the companions, this was a reality that was there then. This is not something unique to this generation at this point in time. And so that's very important, because when we look at mental health as Muslims, we understand that we have in our tradition, there was a focus by specialists, by psychologists, by ulama, who understood this reality and treated it from the beginning. So when we look at mental health, we look at it with a certain lens. So we're going to talk about mental health, some of it, what it is, some of the realities surrounding it. We only have a limited amount of time. We'll talk a little bit about where Islam intersects with this, just to broaden our kind of understanding, and maybe talk a little bit, just very briefly, about what are the most common mental health conditions or disorders that exist today. And so that's something that we'll get to as well. So let's see. Mental illness is and can be, for many people, a scary word. And that's, honestly, to me, when I think about it objectively, it's a very strange thing that it's that way. I want to ask you all a question. When I talk about, or when we talk about somebody who has cancer versus somebody who has a major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, obsessive compulsive disorder, what goes through your mind when you hear the word cancer and you hear the word mental illness? So when we say somebody who's living with cancer, what words come to mind? Anybody? Somebody who's sick? Somebody who's what?
Warrior.
A warrior? Struggling, okay. Hardship. Battling. Right? What else? Pain. Okay. And when we talk about somebody who's dealing with a particular mental illness, what words come to mind? When you hear the words mental illness, what do you think? Speak your mind. Like what do your parents think if you don't want to say what you think, right? And it's not coming from you.
They're not necessarily going to be politically correct, so that's the point that we're getting to. Dramatic.
Dramatic.
Crazy, I heard. sensitive,
Okay. Struggle. Okay. What's that? It's in your head. Okay, good. Weak. So this is very interesting, right? When you think about somebody who has cancer, people talk about somebody who's a cancer survivor, somebody who's battled cancer for years, somebody who, you know, everybody rallies around and supports. When we think about mental illness, somebody who's crazy, it's in their head, you know, they're weak, they don't have iman maybe. So they're two different, but the reality is one is a physical illness and one is a mental illness, right? But unfortunately, humanity for some reason has developed this kind of, this has wrapped mental illness with stigma, although it is a real human condition, just like somebody who has, you know, a certain pain in a certain part of their body, who has a certain disorder as it relates to one of their organs or whatever it may be, right? So mental illness is like any other illness in that sense. It affects the emotional, mental state, psychological state of the human being, just as certain illnesses affect certain part of the body. It's very important to understand that mental illness is not something that is premised upon a lack of faith. Right? The words depressed and low iman should not go together. Right? Somebody may be depressed, but they may have a very high state of iman, actually. Somebody who prays regularly, calls on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, very connected, reads the Quran, but they may be depressed. Can you think of anybody in the Quran who displayed a great amount of sadness in their life? Somebody said it. Sayyidina Yaqub, alayhi salam. Sayyiduna Yaqub, Jacob, the father of Yusuf, the father of Joseph, alayhim assalam jami'an. Right? Sayyidina Yaqub, if you remember in the story of Yusuf, there was a point when he was still crying, still in, still mourning Sayyidina Yusuf. But when was this mentioned? At the time when he lost his second son, Benjamin, which is years later. And the story says, or the Quran says, that Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam was still crying for Yusuf alayhi salam. So you're talking about Yaqub was crying for Sayyidina Yusuf years later, right? So it's a reality, it's a human reality. This is really, really interesting. Our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, or he would make this dua daily, regularly, in the morning and in the evening. He would say, Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min al-hammi wal-hazan, wa a'udhu bika min al-ajzi wal-kasal, wa a'udhu bika min al-jubni wal-bukhl, wa a'udhu bika min ghalabati ad-dayni wa qahri rijal. He sought protection from Allah in 8 things. The first 2 things, which are the only 2 things I want to focus on, he said, "Oh Allah, I seek your protection from al-ham." Al-ham in Arabic is an anxiety that you know what the source of that anxiety is from. In Arabic, there's another word for anxiety that's commonly used, al-gham. Al-gham is an anxiety that comes from something that you don't know what is provoking that anxiety within you, right? The clouds in the sky in Arabic are called what? Al-ghumum, right? The clouds. So your mind is cloudy, it's foggy, you don't know what it is that's making you anxious. So the Prophet makes dua seeking protection from anxiety and seeking protection from depression, from sadness. Oh Allah, I seek your protection from anxiety and sadness, from being worried and from being depressed. And this is very interesting and it's very amazing. Why? Because the 2 most common
mental illnesses in the world today and in America are these two things, anxiety and depression. The Prophet ﷺ is making dua from that because that's a human condition. There's 50 million people in America today that have some sort of anxiety that impacts their life to some extent, and 25 million people that suffer from some sort of depression, right? So subhanAllah, and the Prophet ﷺ is talking about that. The Quran, one of the most common descriptions of Jannah is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, لا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون. In Jannah, the state of the person that's in Jannah will be what? There will be no fear upon them. They won't be anxious. They won't be worried about anything. And they won't be sad about anything that took place before. Jannah, you're not worried about what's to come because anxiety is about something that's gonna happen, and you're not sad, you're not depressed about something that did happen. You're enjoying every single moment in the moment, right? Full pleasure. Your mind is not occupied with anything else. So the Quran highlights this point that it's in the akhirah, in the next life, when we're free of all of that. But this dunya, the reality of this dunya is that we have those realities, anxiety, depression, etc. Those are a part of this life, right? And some people have more than others their share of these realities, right? So I'm just kind of laying the groundwork as to why we talk about that as Muslims. That's at the core, right? That's at the core of some of our understandings.
And we did want to mention just a couple things, and we're going to talk about it a little bit more towards the end, inshallah, that just like this is a common human condition, and some people can be more predisposed to falling into it more than others, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also gave us the cure. So we want to have that in mind as we're talking and as we're saving up to the end, that there's also a cure for this, both medically and, or that can help at least, both medically and spiritually, inshallah.
And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that, مَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ مِن دَاءٍ إِلَّا أَنزَلَ مَعَهُ الدَّوَاء. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that Allah did not send down any illness in whatever realm that may be, except that He also sent down the cure, right? So we don't, and Jazakumullah khairan for pointing that out. So very quickly, just a couple of other things about our Islamic legacy as it relates to, can you grab this back? As it relates and intersects with mental health. Along with the fact that these things are addressed in the Quran, they're addressed in the Sunnah, and there's many people who have written about this. Our scholars of old dealt with this and were the first people in humanity to deal with this reality. So the first psychiatric hospital that was opened in the world was in Baghdad, was in Iraq, in the 700s, in the 8th century, right? Just maybe 100 and some years after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? Muslims were the first to talk about mental illness, to diagnose it, and then to treat it. And then about a century later, the first psychiatric hospital opened up in Cairo, Egypt. These are the first in the world, right? There's a beautiful book for those that are interested in the subject further, by Abu Zayd al-Balkhi. He was a 9th century scholar from the 800s. 800s, we're talking about Christian era. And his book is called, in English, Sustenance of the Soul. It's a piece of a larger book, but basically he addressed some of these things. There's a psychiatrist, her name is Dr. Rania Awad. She's from the Bay Area, and she's written about how when you look at his symptomology that he's outlined, for example, for obsessive compulsive disorder, that are mentioned today in the books that we use, that people in the field of mental health use to diagnose folks, it almost matches up completely what he has put in this book some, 1,200 plus years ago. So we have a long and deep legacy as it's tied and related to dealing with mental health. And so when we look at it, this is the reason why I'm starting with this, because I want us to look at it from this lens. It's not something external to us. It's actually an internal part of a reality that we've been dealing with and treating for a long, long time. So really just going back to our roots and re-exploring. So it's definitely not something that we should, be afraid of or run away from, and so on and so forth. Tayyib, I want to talk a little bit about the realities as it shapes in your lives. So there is a tremendous amount of stigma, as you all know, attached to mental illness. You all are growing up at a very good time, though, when it comes to this particular subject. And the reason why I say that is because there was a time, and you could say one generation back, your parents' time, the time when they were in college, the way mental illness was looked at and the way it's looked at today are two very different realities. And the stigma is, alhamdulillah, being lifted away. But in the Muslim community, we still have our things that we need to work with or work through. So these are the kind of ends of the continuum, and then I'm going to talk about where we need to be in the middle, right? The ends, the extremes are this. When people look at mental illness, they see it as something that, is taboo. We don't want to talk about it. That person is sick. And it's because they don't understand who Allah is. They're not praying. They need to make dua. They need to read Quran. They need to, right? That's one end of the spectrum of people who don't properly understand mental health. And that may be some of, people in the community, your parents, your, extended family members. That's how they talk about it, right? He's sick. Let's go to the sheikh and he's going to give us, a secret formula. And then somehow magically this 10 years of depression is going to be lifted, right? People come to me and they ask me, like, Sheikh, is there any surah we can read? My son's been struggling with depression for 7 years. Like, I wish it was that easy, right?
And the sad reality too, unfortunately, is that some of our leaders have that understanding still. Because, alhamdulillah, the stigma is being lifted, and alhamdulillah, you're a combo sheikh, so you have the mental health background, with a degree, alhamdulillah, and then also an imam, but unfortunately the reality is not everybody has that training, and so I just want to kind of acknowledge for some of you who have maybe approached some of your leaders and you've been told that, well, maybe if you make more dua, maybe if you yes, that can help, we definitely don't want to disregard that, but you may have been told that, even by sometimes well-meaning leaders as well.
So that's one end of the spectrum, right? People put everything in that basket. The other end is that this has nothing to do with the deen, has nothing to do with Islam, and I need to seek treatment. I need to go, see a counselor, a therapist, like psychologist, psychiatrist, perhaps. Maybe I even need to take medication, right? But Islam doesn't have anything to do. The reality is that Islam is always the middle road. And the reality is that this is a holistic, we as Muslims, we have the best course and the best cure to deal with mental health disorders. And that is that we take the means that are available to us by modern day modalities that have been developed to deal with people, for people who are struggling with mental illness to find help. In other words, to go to talk therapy, right? Perhaps those that do need some sort of medication and they find balance within that. But within that as well, turning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is an important part of that trajectory, right? If you're seeking to be better and you're seeking to be whole, we understand that the human being is a multi-dimensional individual. We have our biological self, right? And there are certain, things that are there that may be in balance, may not be in balance. We have our emotional, psychological self, where there may have been certain childhood traumas and difficulties, some huge issues as it relates to our upbringing, the connection that was there or was not there between parent and child, right? Then we have the social reality that we live in, the environment that we live in, poverty, people who live, in a state of instability where they move, refugees who don't have a homeland, who don't have a place where they're going from place to place. Those are destabilizing factors. So you have biology, psychology, the social aspect of the human, and then the spiritual aspect of the human being, right? So as Muslims, we need to look at all of those factors in terms of understanding who we are and trying to come to a place of wellness. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that relate to these different realities. So how many of you are in the social sciences, by the way? Good. So those of you that study social sciences, you may come across some of these concepts, right? The biopsychosocial spiritual model, that we are all of those things, and who we become, the whole question of nature versus nurture, right? Well, all of that's wrapped up into one, right? And so that's why we're addressing all the things. So we'll talk about a few of these things, and why that stigma, and we'll focus on this a bit because this is ultimately the reality. And there may be people sitting right next to you, or even you yourself, who may be in denial, or who maybe would not open up to your friend right next to you and tell them that, yeah, man, I've thought of hurting myself before, or I have cut myself before, or what's the point of living? There's no hope, there's no good for me. I'm not useful to anybody, or these thoughts keep creeping into my mind, or I just get down, man, and I can't get out of it. I don't really feel like getting up in the bed in the morning. Forget about Fajr, right? I just don't feel like getting up, period. Or when it comes to school, and you start talking about tests, I can't. My brain it doesn't allow me to focus, or I can't focus, right? I'm talking about symptomologies of all of these different realms, all of these different sort of mental health disorders are out there. So why is it that we get stuck in seeking help for these things?
And one of the things when it comes to the stigma and that we get our own selves stuck is that realize half of, and this is I'm just using this loosely, but half of the battle is being able to acknowledge that something may be going on, just like you would readily tell your friend, I'm struggling with the flu today. What would be wrong with saying, I'm feeling down? Use your own words. It's been a while now. Actually, now that I come to think of it, I keep having these thoughts. If we're able to talk about that, and especially to somebody that we trust, don't put it on blast to people, and they're maybe going to judge you. Unfortunately, that's the reality. Nobody would judge you for a flu, but they may judge you for that. Just being able to acknowledge it to yourself, number one, and then to be able to talk to a professional and just start to talk about it is half the battle. Half the battle is there. And part of, I think, the stigma that we place on ourselves, aside from what's already out there, we feel like it's a label. Once I have it, I'm forever I'm gonna label myself. It's gonna go on my record, right? It's gonna go on my medical record that I saw a therapist. Who cares? Just like, did I have a record full of how many times I visited a therapist and how many times I visited the nurse practitioner and the doctor for different health reasons? You had a question?
Jazakumullah khairan. So let's keep a few minutes at the end for solid questions. that yeah, it is an important. I'm going to talk about some of this stuff about related to stigma, and the answer may be included in there, but if not, we'll come to that in the end, inshallah. So the impact of stigma is real, right? The impact of stigma is real. It has an impact on the individual. If you stigmatize it yourself, and this is what we're talking about, lifting the stigma even from your own self than the way in which you see it. Right? If you stigmatize it yourself, what happens? It erodes your motivation to seek help. You're going to be less likely to get help because you see this as, well, there's something wrong with me and I just somehow need to magically snap out of it. Well, typically it doesn't work that way. There may be another level of care that you may need to seek, right? So if you don't have that proper understanding, then you yourself won't be motivated to go and seek help. When if you did, there would be so much that you could gain from that, right? Let me ask a question. How many people here know somebody that has a thought of taking their life? Look at your hands right now. Look at that, right? How many people here know of someone that struggles with mental illness? Right? MashaAllah. So we know it's there, right? We know it's there. And removing that, that imaginary stigma is the first step. And then when we do stigmatize it, then we're not going to seek out help. We're not going to seek out help. It also, in and of itself, lowers the rate of recovery. In other words, if you see this as a problem within yourself and you don't blame the cause, which is you're depressed because you have depression, right? Then what happens? You yourself, you know how when you have the will to work something, you're going to work through it, right? When you're sick, well, if you're just down and you're sick, man, I'm sick and I'm just never going to get better and nothing's ever going to change, and you're going to stay sick. But if you have the will and the desire, you're going to seek out help, right? For families, what our brother there was talking about, what happens when our family members themselves don't acknowledge these realities, right? Mom, dad, whoever, they say, man, you just need to pray more. Inshallah.
And listen to music.
Some of our scholars in the past, by the way, they did use music therapy to deal with people who had certain sorts of mental illness, which is, subhanAllah, very progressive and incredible. Anyways, when our families themselves, they don't acknowledge and they don't understand, sometimes sometimes it's a battle that's not worth fighting, right? Because they're not going to get it and they're not going to understand. But we still need to move forward and get help, right?
And so now since we only have a few minutes left, talking about the solution now. So we've addressed the problem. We understand why we hesitate from seeking help. We understand, inshallah, what the problem, and knowing that this is a human condition. SubhanAllah, and when you were mentioning, it's so interesting. When we talk about cancer, we know it's a medical condition, and acknowledging that, well, mental illness is a medical condition too. There are hormonal imbalances, there can be different chemical imbalances, there can be other physical reasons why somebody is suffering from this mental illness. So part of getting help is knowing that there's a cure. It may be something to the point where if somebody has certain illness that they'll be struggling for their whole life, but they'll know how to manage it. Well, that's amazing. Right? I know the cure, I'm not going to say it's something like go get a medical marijuana license, okay? There's no benefit in getting something that's going to intoxify your brain, intoxicant your brain, and it has toxic chemicals in it. So let's not say, well, there's a cure, let's find it in these random places, but the actual rooted, I want to talk about a few things. Did you know that the bacteria in your gut, and this is proven, you can look up in psychology today, you can look up in different holistic areas, both so in Western medicine and in Eastern medicine, that what you eat and the amount of bacteria that's in your gut can actually affect your brain in terms of contributing to anxiety, to depression, bipolar. That is a huge factor. A lot of times what happens when we were talking about the spectrum, when Sheikh Suhail was talking about on one side, this is only a medical condition, you have to take medication, you can only seek therapy, Islam has nothing to do with it, and going on the other end, it's because you're not making enough dua, you're not praying enough. We also have to ask ourselves, well, what are we eating? If you're eating high levels of sugar, of processed foods, what is your body gonna do with it? It doesn't know what to do with those toxic materials. So what ends up happening is that it affects the way you think. You can be more prone. So let's say if something negative or bad were to happen to you, instead of you being able to process it, because your mind is not being able to process normally, you'll get more affected and be more anxious or depressed about this negative effect, as opposed to somebody else who had a healthier diet. So we don't look at those things. We only say, oh, medication, this is all I need to take, I don't need to worry. You absolutely need to be worrying. What are you putting into your bodies? Is it whole? If it's toxic, it will contribute to the toxicity of your body. So in many ways, mental illness is also an inflammatory disease. It's caused by inflammation. So we don't want to remove that. Food affects you. Sleep. If you don't get regular sleep, which sometimes is caused by mental illness, but that it can be a cycle. It can be absolutely a vicious cycle. If you don't get enough sleep, that can absolutely contribute to mental illness as well. So that's something you need to work towards. What are things that you can do to improve your sleep? Sometimes fixing your diet will help you to, which is one of the reasons why you're having the insomnia. You'll actually get better sleep, which will actually help you with your condition. Regulating and making sure that you're getting your solid sleep from at least no later than midnight. It's very fun to stay up late, but if we're doing that a lot, you're not getting that same quality sleep, even if you get the same number of hours total in the day. Toxins in the environment, a lot. You know, I used to be one of those people, subhanAllah, I used to make fun of like, oh my God, you know, BPA this and PTFO, you know, worrying about the pans that you use and the chemicals and plastic. It absolutely affects your hormones for both male and female. We're talking about fragrances. I used to love the Bath and Body soaps. I used to love them, yes. Those fragrances have plastic in it. The phthalates is in every fragrance. Any manufactured fragrance that's not literally from an essential oil has phthalates in it. Phthalates is a hormonal blocker. It blocks your hormones. So our whole body is made up of hormones and very, very precise biological processes. Can you believe the things that we're using on our hands, spraying, the cologne, the deodorant, all of those things are actually blocking the processes, including how we think, how we process, the cortisol levels, which is the levels of hormone that is released when you're stressed out. All of that is out of whack. And then we're saying, well, this has nothing to do with it. So food, sleep, the toxins in your environment, you absolutely have to look at. And then you have to look at your friends, your social support. Do you have somebody that you can talk to share that is a big relief. If you're able to say, you know, I'm feeling down. I don't feel good. I keep worrying about this thing. And I keep thinking, we talked about this earlier. I keep thinking that Allah didn't forgive me for what I've done and now I'm being punished for it. Do I have somebody that I can trust, that I can talk to? And then that's where a therapist can help. Maybe you don't have that support, someone who will hear you on this level, but that's where a therapist can come into play. And then you have the spiritual support. We talked about the 99 names of Allah and actually believing that Allah is Ash-Shafi. He can cure me of this disease just like I can get cured of the flu. Why do I know that eventually I'll get over the flu, but I think, well, this anxiety, depression, I'm born with it, or it runs in my family? Did you know that your environmental factors, there's something called epigenetics for any of you that are in the science field, and that your environmental factors can turn off or on your genes? So even if this is something that runs in your family, don't just say, well, I'm doomed, I was born like that. You actually have control. Just that knowledge of control is powerful. And more than that, having the knowledge that I can ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is the ultimate one that can change my condition. Calling upon Him with sincere belief that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can change my condition is powerful. That I'm not just a slave to my condition. That I am a slave to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and only He can change my condition. So knowing these things is so empowering that we don't get stuck into this vicious cycle of I'm depressed and I'm never gonna get out of it, so I don't do anything to help myself get out of it, right? Having too much free time, allowing sometimes those negative repetitive thoughts in your mind, and we talked about some of the social factors, the family factors that affect you. that just furthers you into it. But when you're able to do some of these practical measures, it can be life-changing and transformative.
So I just want to end on this note because we only have a couple of minutes, and actually I probably misspoke. I don't know if we do have time for questions. They said there's actually probably not time. And we're available after if people want to talk. Our Prophet ﷺ, it's said about him, كان النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم إذا حزبه أمر صلى. When the Prophet ﷺ, whenever he was faced with an affair that really weighed heavy on him, what did he do? He ran to prayer, right? So prayer is an important reality here. It may not be the solve-all, but it's a piece of it, right? So life is tough. You're going through whatever struggles you're going through, your individual struggles, your mental health struggles. But to go into the mindset and say that, well, you know, I pray day and night and I don't see any benefit, nothing's happening. That's not the approach that we want to use. You keep praying, you keep doing what you're doing, and seek all of the other means that are also going to be part of that curative and that healing process for you. And inshallah, with time, that help will come, right? But don't neglect this piece, right? Our Prophet ﷺ, he also said that in terms of, and there's various dua that he would make. He said, for example, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, ما قال عبد قط إذا أصابه هم أو حزن اللهم إني عبدك ابن عبدك إلى آخر الدعاء. The Prophet ﷺ, he said that there is no servant of Allah that when something weighs heavy on him, he's suffering from anxiety or depression, ham, hazan, these two words. Nobody who's suffering from that condition, and then he makes this following dua, and there's a few hadith like this that prescribe particular dua for us to read, because when you read it, you're ultimately acknowledging that Allah is the one who's going to bring the cure. And then you're also acknowledging your peace in that, and you're going to be motivated to seek all the other means that you need to seek that cure, right? So alhamdulillah, that as Muslims, we have this comprehensive, holistic understanding that yes, prayer is part of it, dua is part of it, right? Turning to Allah, to the ultimate source of healing, is part of it. And that's not discounting the fact that we also need to go talk to a therapist, right? We need to seek psychological services, counseling services at our university that are available for us there or in the community. And that for some people it may also mean some sort of supplement or even prescription sort of medicine to seek. So it's very important to understand, that holistic way that we see this reality. Mental health is part of the larger health reality of the human being, and the cure also lies in approaching it from all of these different angles. So this was just kind of shining some light on this issue, hopefully lifting off a cover in terms of some people may have in terms of the stigma that's attached towards it. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to teach us that which benefits us and to benefit from what we learn and to increase us in knowledge. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.